Let's start off this morning telling you a story of a church that completely failed. Before I returned to Massachusetts, I spent a year working with the Southside Alliance of Churches in Fort Worth, Texas. It's a coalition of many congregations, and we work on meeting needs in a very poor community. One of our member churches was First Presbyterian Church in Fort Worth. First Presbyterian is a huge, huge congregation. What fascinated me about them, however, was not their huge congregation and all their incredible contributions to the work we were doing. It was their associate pastor and her story, and the story of the congregation she brought with her to First Presbyterian. She was the minister of the Hemphill Presbyterian Church in Fort Worth, on Hemphill Street in the South Side. And when that church was founded in the middle of the 19th century, the Presbyterians who attended that church and lived in that neighborhood lived in one of the more affluent areas of town. That area of town now has a population where 99% of the students in the schools get free or reduced school lunches. Neighborhoods changed. The Hemphill Presbyterian Church, a number of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago now, found itself down to 30, 40 members, a big old historic building, and running out of money. And that's when they did something that was spectacularly a failure. They closed their church. They sold the building. They made a lot of money from the building. And what they did is they bought another abandoned building down the street and opened the Southside Neighborhood Center, which now feeds people and has clothing. And when I left, was setting up a dental office that would provide free dental care for homeless people and anyone under 18 in the neighborhood. They were setting up an eye exam center that would provide free eye care for homeless people and anyone under 18 in the neighborhood. And a lot of them, the few dozen, became members of First Presbyterian downtown. And yet, they all went to church on Wednesday nights, Hemphill Street, at the community center. For a group of Christians, it was a fairly impressive display of dying to oneself to rise again. And took an incredible amount of courage. And they didn't fail. They were a great success. Sometimes what looks like failure on the outside is a grand success you can't see. Maybe because you don't know the whole story, or because we have odd notions of success sometimes in our culture. I think we tend to idolize success. And we define success in our culture by money and position and status. And success isn't always about money and position and status or power. It's about how much love you're putting into the world and how much you're letting the world love you. No one, no group, none of us succeeds in any way without making mistakes and falling down and getting up again. And I think we tend to skip over this. We don't like the failing part. That's the hard part. We just want to end up at the goal where we want to go, where we don't have to worry about all the mistakes and the tripping up again. And we forget that that's a continuous cycle. One of the things caught my interest on the internet recently was a professor at Princeton University, hope I get his name right, Johannes Hanshofer, an assistant professor of psychology, who tweeted a resume of his life's failures. Fantastic. The document contains sections titled Degree Programs I Did Not Get Into, Research Funding I Applied For and Was Not Awarded, and paper rejections from academic journals. It was an incredibly long document. And who would know that but him? Because his public faces, he's an assistant professor at a very prestigious university. He must have had some modicum of success. but it included all those other things. Part of the difficulty with our culture's views of success and failure is it does something that really misses the mark and I think hurts a lot of us. We tend to equate failing with being a failure. Robert Fulghum, the UU minister, famous for writing his essays about kindergarten and whatnot, has a great essay about Jimmy Carter, former president. And he says that Carter failed as big and profoundly as anyone possibly could on our political stage. In fact, the time he lost the election to Ronald Reagan is, historically one of the worst losses in presidential election history. But, Fulghum writes, he has probably done as much good in the world after he was president as anyone who ever has held the office. Because failing is not the same thing as being a failure. You can fail on grand scales. I commiserate with Jimmy Carter. As some of you know, one time many years ago, I was the Green Party's candidate for lieutenant governor here in Massachusetts and wound up with a staggering, mind-blowing 3% of the vote. Anytime I meet someone and they introduce themselves to me and say they voted for Jill and I give them a hug. I said, 3% club is a small group here. But the whole experience to me was not a failure. We got to talk about a lot of important things, a lot of important values that we share as Unitarian Universalists. And I got to meet a lot of people, and I got to really understand a little better how politics works and how politicians have to get things done, especially people I really disagree with about things. It was a great lesson. So, yeah, it was a failed campaign in the sense that you didn't win, but that's not the measure of success. We did a lot, and I learned a lot. I got a lot out of that. As a group of people in a congregation trying to have a faith community together and make our mark in the world, I think it's important we get a grip on failure. Because if we're really going to do the best we can do, be the best we can be, and be the kind of congregation we all want to see arise here into the future, there's going to be failing along the way to that plateau. One of the things people who like to talk about mission, like me, talk about is that any mission worth having is one you can fail at. Because if you're guaranteed success, you're probably not reaching for very much. As we continue our journey together, and as our graduates continue their lives into young adulthood, I remind us that the goals we set for ourselves and the things we want to try and accomplish need to be big enough that we can indeed fail at them. It keeps a little pressure on us to try really hard because success is not guaranteed. Like the guy in the story and instructions, though, whenever we turn back, we don't lose face, there's no shame. But if you continue on, you're going to find all the adventures, the success and failures you have. At one point, if you know who you are and where you're going, will, even if it's a different place, land you back home, which is where he ends up in the story. We tend to shy away from failure, I think, because, especially as groups, and churches are notorious for this, right? We're very risk averse. We don't even want to try anything until we're about 95% sure we're going to succeed at it. But that risk aversion, as individuals and as groups, sometimes just keeps us from even trying things. Or for trying things again and again, and then we insulate ourselves from the failure, but we also insulate ourselves from the learning and the growth. And therefore we become less resilient. One of the things that trying and failing and learning and doing better does for us is it makes us resilient. That might not have worked, but we can get up and we can do it again. I'm a big believer in spiritual practices. Every group needs to develop something they do with intention and depth and regularity and dedication to something beyond themselves. And I think taking up change, just being okay with the changes of life, is a great spiritual practice to take up because it makes us resilient. So when we understand that gradual change is the spiritual playing field of our lives, dealing with things such as loss and insecurity, as well as new opportunities for growth and learning, become in deep, intentional, regular practices of what living together in a community of faith is all about. Developing change as a spiritual practice helps us bounce back when conflict or difficulties arise, and change as spiritual practice makes us resilient and less afraid to try and fail. And I know I'm right about that because it's the only thing I've ever had published in a UU World magazine. Being resilient is a new study, actually. Resilience is the capacity of a system to undergo change and still retain the basic function and structure of the system. In other words, it's the capacity to undergo some change without crossing a threshold into a different system. You know, it's interesting, I think, that we as Unitarian Universalists, we have no trouble with the concept of evolution. We are frequently defenders of science and debates when something as creationism rears its head. And yet sometimes in our own congregations, we are afraid of the evolution and change that is a necessary spiritual practice. We sometimes operate out of the assumption that there is only one best way to do and be, and if we can figure it out and use it, we can conquer anything that confronts us. And this just isn't the reality in the postmodern world, which is open source and collaborative and exists in an environment of constant change. A resilient system sees failure as part of learning. Failure is intrinsic, healthy, normal, and necessary to complex systems. And we need systems that are better at sensing emerging pathways, that encourage cooperation rather than division. We need systems where failure in one component of the system does not bring down other components of the system. That's really a sort of design brief for the 21st century. It's Andrew Zolli on the radio show On Being with Krista Tippett about his book, Resilience. And I think this is true for individuals and congregations. One of my favorite metaphors is glass blowing. I may have told you this one before, that when glass is molten and hot, you can shape it into anything you want. But once it hardens, there's only one way to change it, which is break it, shatter it. And so our goal as individuals, I think, and as a community, is to stay hot, malleable, so that we don't get to the place where when the only way to change is to break. And I think if we can keep that in mind about how important it is to be that malleable and resilient, we're less afraid to try, to risk, to fail, and to see those things as all negatives. And then we can in turn see them as positive steps on learning, growing, and achieving what we want to achieve.